Right now, 11 days into an active war, the Gulf monarchies are facing a question that no amount of diplomatic language can soften. Did hosting American military bases make them safer? Or did it turn their cities, airports, and oil fields into targets in someone else's war? Because here is what actually happened. On February 28th, the US and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran. And Iran did not wait. Within hours, Tehran fired back. Not just at Israel, but at every country in the Gulf that hosts American military infrastructure, simultaneously. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the UAE, Ali Al Salam in Kuwait, the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, all struck in the same operational window. Iran's message, delivered in missile trajectories, was precise and deliberate. If American weapons are launched from your soil is part of this war. And then on March 1st, Iran's security chief Ali Larijani made it even more explicit in a public statement posted directly on X for the entire region to read. He wrote, "The countries of the region must either prevent the use of their soil by America against Iran themselves, or we will." What followed that statement in the next 48 hours is exactly where this title comes from. Because Iran did not wait for an answer. Within 2 days of Larijani's warning, Iranian missiles and drones struck the UAE again, and Qatar intercepted another missile wave. The IRGC followed up with a statement making clear that every base hosting U.S. assets across the region remained a primary target going forward. The Gulf states had a 48-hour window to either demand American forces stand down or accept that the strikes would continue. That window closed with no public response from any Gulf capital. That silence, and what it reveals about the impossible position these governments are now in, is what this video is actually about. Here is what makes this so much more complicated than the headlines suggest. These governments did not choose this conflict and said so openly before it began. In late January 2026, according to Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, Gulf states actually blocked U.S. military base and airspace access over fears of exactly this kind of Iranian retaliation. They lobbied Washington. They expressed concern through diplomatic channels. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, all made clear they wanted restraint, not escalation from their territory. The strikes happened anyway, using infrastructure positioned across their territories, launched from bases they had tried to keep out of this war entirely. Now here is where the picture gets even more layered. Publicly, the Gulf states have already made their choice, and it is firmly against Iran. The GCC issued statements condemning Iran's attacks as treacherous and heinous. Saudi Arabia called them cowardly. Qatar's prime minister said Iran's justifications were totally rejected. But CNBC reported on March 10th that behind those public statements, the attacks have created what Gulf officials themselves described as a huge trust gap that will last for years. And the Soufan Center, citing the Financial Times, reported March 7th that Gulf governments quietly launched internal reviews of their U.S. security arrangements. The question being asked inside those governments is not rhetorical. It is operational. Did American bases deter Iran or make the strike inevitable? Middle East Eye quoted Omani analyst Abdullah Babood, putting it plainly, Iran is making sure the Gulf states start to think that the U.S. military bases are not a strategic asset, but a liability. That gap between the public condemnation of Iran and the private reassessment of America is the real story unfolding in the Gulf right now. If this kind of layered analysis is what you come here for, drop a comment. Do you think the Gulf will quietly push America out or double down on U.S. protection? And hit like so more people find this. Here is something Trump himself admitted publicly, and almost nobody in mainstream coverage picked up on it the way it deserved. When asked about Iran striking the Gulf states, Trump said his biggest surprise since launching this war was exactly that, Iran hitting America's closest and richest partners. A former U.S. intelligence official told Middle East Eye the response was blunt. It's as if the U.S. was operating and planning in a bubble for the last year. That official added that Gulf rulers had personally warned Trump about this exact scenario in direct conversations, and presumably his own intelligence briefings confirmed the same risk. The governments whose cities are now burning told Washington this would happen. Washington launched anyway, and now the surprise is genuine. That is not a footnote. That is the central failure of the strategic calculation behind Operation Epic Fury, and the Gulf states are paying the price for it in real economic terms right now, because the damage is not abstract. It is measurable, documented, and arrived faster than any Gulf economic diversification plan was built to absorb. Start with Qatar. On March 2nd, Iranian drones struck energy facilities at Ras Laffan and Mesaid, the operational heart of Qatar Energy, the world's largest LNG producer. Qatar Energy halted all liquefied natural gas production and declared force majeure on its contracts with buyers, confirmed by Al Jazeera and Reuters sourcing on March 2nd. Within hours, European benchmark gas prices jumped nearly 50%. Asian LNG benchmark prices surged almost 39% in a single trading session across global markets. Qatar's energy minister, Saad al-Kaabi, warned on March 6th that if the war continues, other Gulf producers may be forced to follow, and that the result would bring down economies of the world. Now move to Saudi Arabia. Iranian drones targeted the Ras Tanura refinery, one of the largest refining complexes on the planet, owned by Aramco, which controls 12% of global oil output. Satellite imagery released by Vantor confirmed visible structural damage at the site. A fire broke out. Operations were partially halted, per AFP and Saudi state media reporting. The UAE absorbed the broadest damage of any Gulf state, over 10 times the scale of the 2022 Houthi attacks, according to the Atlantic Council's March 2nd analysis. Jebel Ali Port, the largest port in the Middle East, was struck. Brent crude rose from around $70 before the war to over $110 per barrel within days, per Reuters and market data compiled by Wikipedia. On March 11th, today, Iranian drones struck near Dubai International Airport, the world's busiest for international travel, wounding 4 people per the Dubai media office. In my view, this economic pressure is the core of Iran's strategy, not to destroy Gulf infrastructure permanently, but to make these states feel the direct cost of hosting this war. CNBC cited analysts on March 10th, saying Iran aimed to create maximum economic discomfort to pressure Gulf governments into pushing Washington toward a ceasefire. And it is partially working. Foreign Policy reported that Gulf governments, unable to absorb the mounting economic disruption, are already pushing the Trump administration to pursue a ceasefire. But here's the contradiction. Every missile that hits a Gulf city makes it harder for those governments to be seen as neutral, and politically pushes them closer to backing U.S. operations openly. That tension between economic pressure to end the war and political pressure to stand with Washington is the live wire running through every Gulf capital right now. Here's the detail that reframes everything happening in the Gulf right now, and that most coverage is not connecting clearly enough. The Gulf states bought American weapons to defend against Iran, and right now they're using those exact weapons to defend against strikes caused by a war America launched. That irony was put precisely by Omani analyst Abdullah Babood, speaking to Middle East Eye. The Gulf purchased the gear to deter Iran, but ended up deploying it to absorb consequences of U.S. decisions. And here is what makes this moment structurally different from every previous Gulf crisis. The American protection model that has defined this region since 1991 is being stress-tested in real time and showing cracks. The cracks were already forming before this war. In 2019, Iran-backed drones struck Saudi Aramco's oil facilities at Ab Qaik, one of the most significant infrastructure attacks in the region's modern history. The U.S. did not respond militarily. The message that's sent to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi was unmistakable. American protection has conditions and limits that are not written in any defense agreement. Saudi Arabia and the UAE drew a quiet conclusion from 2019, and both began pursuing diplomatic normalization with Iran as a form of independent risk management outside the American security framework. That Saudi-Iran rapprochement, brokered by China in 2023, was the direct result of Gulf states deciding that self-managed coexistence with Tehran was more reliable than waiting for Washington to protect them. Now that entire calculation has been blown apart. Iran is striking the very states that tried hardest to avoid this confrontation, and they are getting no additional protection from Washington in exchange. Middle East Eye reported that Gulf countries running low on missile interceptors are being stonewalled by the U.S., which is itself facing a global shortage of interceptors to supply to partners. Read that again. The Gulf states are under active missile attack. They are running low on the interceptors they need to defend their own cities, and their primary security partner cannot restock them. The Carnegie Endowment published an analysis making the deeper point explicit. Gulf rulers, it noted, are confronting the limits of their ability to spend their way to influence at the White House. Although Trump is clearly willing to sell Gulf states whatever military hardware they want to buy, that has not translated into any leader's ability to reshape the president's war-forward decision-making, Carnegie wrote. The UAE closed its embassy in Tehran and withdrew its ambassador entirely, per the national reporting on March 9th. That is a formal diplomatic rupture, a significant escalation in its own right. Yet the UAE official in the same report said Iran's missile capabilities are now under scrutiny, and any future settlement must go beyond the nuclear issue to address the missile program directly. That is the Gulf's new diplomatic position, crystallized by war. Not just limit Iran's nuclear program, limit the weapons Iran used to strike their cities this week. In my view, this is a fundamental shift in regional security architecture. For 3 decades, the Gulf's strategy rested on 2 pillars: U.S. military presence as deterrence, and managed coexistence with Iran as insurance. Both pillars cracked in the same week. The U.S. presence attracted the strikes. The managed coexistence with Iran did not prevent them. And now the Gulf is navigating without either reliable pillar holding. The Quincy Institute's Anel Shalain put the Gulf leaders' dilemma plainly. Calculate which is the lesser evil: complete chaos in Iran, or a more hostile and frightened regime that survives the war? That calculation has no clean answer, and the governments making it are doing so while their airports are closed, their refineries are damaged, and their interceptor stockpiles are depleting in real time. Nobody in the Gulf asked to be at this crossroads, but here they are. And the decisions being made quietly right now will reshape this region for decades. Here is the most honest summary of where things stand on March 11th, 2026, 11 days into an active war with no ceasefire in sight. The GCC states have condemned Iran publicly and in the strongest possible language, but they have not joined the war. And critically, they are still refusing to let the U.S. launch offensive strikes from their territory. That is not a minor detail. It is a live signal being sent simultaneously to Washington and Tehran about exactly how far the Gulf's loyalty extends under fire. The Center for American Progress published an analysis this week spelling out the strategic fork these governments now face with unusual directness and precision. If neutrality cannot shield Gulf states from retaliation, their analysis noted, the logic of hedging weakens considerably, and closer alignment with the U.S. during crises becomes more rational, not less. But the same analysis identified a hard counterweight. Iran still retains missiles, maritime disruption capability, and militia networks that Gulf governments cannot ignore regardless of alignment. So the Gulf is not choosing between safety and danger. It is choosing between two different kinds of danger and trying to calculate which one is more manageable over the long term. Al Jazeera's March 1st analysis framed the fork. The Gulf becomes the front line of a prolonged great power conflict, or it leverages its diplomatic capital to push for de-escalation while hardening its own defenses. The Soufan Center reported March 7th that Gulf governments have quietly begun internal reviews of their U.S. security arrangements, asking whether those bases deterred Iran or simply attracted the strikes. Mondoweiss noted March 6th that no Gulf state is publicly signaling it will ask the U.S. to remove its bases after the war, but that outcome remains possible even without any current official hint. What is already happening, documented by The National on March 9th, is that the UAE is demanding any future settlement with Iran must address Tehran's missile program, not just its nuclear program. That is a new red line drawn directly by a Gulf state based on 11 days of being hit by Iranian missiles. It did not exist before February 28th. It exists now. Saudi Arabia kept largely out of Iran's crosshairs in the opening days by refusing U.S. strikes from its territory, and is now managing its own long-term calculation about what comes next. A weakened Iran reduces the biggest challenge to Saudi dominance, but a collapsed Iran could send a refugee crisis across the water and create instability that no Gulf economy is designed to absorb. These are not abstract geopolitical scenarios. These are operational calculations happening inside the finance ministries, defense councils, and royal courts of countries whose airports are still partially closed today. In my view, what this 11-day war has already done, regardless of how it ends, is permanently change the question Gulf governments ask about American military presence on their soil. The question used to be, how do we manage the relationship with Washington to maintain stability? The question now is, does this relationship still deliver what it promised? That question has no clean answer today. But the fact that it is being asked at all, in briefing rooms, think tank analyses, and financial reviews of force majeure clauses, tells you where the Gulf is heading. The Gulf that emerges from this conflict will be very different from the one that entered it 11 days ago. That much is already certain. Everything else is still being written. If this kind of analysis is what you come to this channel for, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The next 72 hours in this conflict will matter more than the last 11 days combined. Stay with us.